So the war in Ukraine has completely changed the future for all of humanity. And that is something that is true for all humans, not just Ukrainians and not just Russians, and not just Europeans either. Even people who have never heard of Ukraine, who live in completely different hemispheres and are living their lives maybe oblivious to what is going on, if you can believe it, even those people will have their futures and their children's futures completely defined by what is going on in Ukraine today. And I know a lot of people realize that that's kind of what you're supposed to say, but a lot of people don't realize why that is actually true and why the war in Ukraine is so significant, and therefore why it is so strategically significant to every nation on the planet to have an interest in what is going on over here. Humanity has seen a couple of different pivot points like the one we're seeing now when it comes to world history. For example, when we look at World War I, that was a major pivot point when it comes to technology. We can also look at the end of World War II as a major pivot point when it comes to technology and the introduction of atomic weapons. And what we see when we look back at every pivot point when it comes to military technology in history is everybody doesn't think it can happen until it actually happens. Everybody thinks that that pivot is preposterous, but then the pivot ends up happening. Whether that is the movement from bronze to iron, from iron to steel, from cavalry in World War I to actual tanks, actual machines, it doesn't matter. People throughout history have always done a terrible job of actually appreciating the fact that the world they live in is subject to change. And when it comes to Ukraine, a whole lot of people are doing that, and they are not realizing how significant the changes really are. The changes that I'm talking about are how significant the weapons that have been developed and are being developed for this war really are. And this is a subject that a lot of people know at a high level, but they don't realize the deep implications of, and how these small changes completely change geopolitical strategy as a whole for everybody, even the people who will never fight a war, even the people who will never develop or use any of these weapons. Obviously, the big change we've seen in the war in Ukraine is the world has pivoted from large assaults with, for example, tanks and armored vehicles, and even large air-based attacks, to a more refined type of strategy around all of these things that is defined by drone warfare. In the war in Ukraine, we have seen $1,000 drones be able to take out multi-million-dollar tanks with ease, and the drone is actually seen as the more deadly weapon than this very expensive tank that really defined how people fought and won, for example, World War II. Now people are realizing that a lot of the armor that countries have stockpiled, for example, the United States, but also countries in Europe, is becoming obsolete. And even though at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, a lot of people mocked Ukraine and said that, drones don't win wars, they're cool, but they don't win wars, the entire world is now seeing that drones very much do, in fact, win wars. And as the war has been progressing for several years, both Ukraine and Russia have progressed beyond mere drones. And this is very worrying for countries that aren't paying sufficient attention. Each country is attempting to develop AI weapons, and Ukraine is ahead of Russia here, and they have actually developed AI-powered drones that can independently select and eliminate targets, for example, when they get cut off from their operator during an operation. And this technology is still in its infancy, but because of all of the battlefield data that Ukraine is able to get, it is developing far faster than anybody ever expected. The same is true when it comes to battlefield robotics, where we have robotics, not just drones in the sky, but also land-based robotics that have done some initial assaults on, for example, Russian positions. And that's been very interesting to see, again, in its infancy, but it's definitely going to get there, just how early in World War I, the tanks were in their infancy and they weren't very effective, but eventually the tank became the weapon that defined warfare in the 20th century. Now, to most people watching this video, these technological changes that I'm describing are nothing new. Most people have heard of this. But what a lot of people haven't heard is the geopolitical changes that are happening on the back of these technological changes, which arguably are a bigger deal than the technological changes themselves, or at least as big of a deal. And for example, we can see this happening and some big changes that have happened geopolitically as the war in Ukraine has progressed. Where now today, a lot of countries are changing their tune. And they're realizing that while it would still help Ukraine to get a lot of our conventional weapons, they don't actually really need them. And what is going on now is the Western world is actually finding itself in need of Ukraine's weapons. Early on, for example, when it came to Russia's war against Ukraine, it was common practice in the United States to portray Ukraine as desperate and basically only able to survive if they got handouts of military equipment from the United States. And so the United States, a lot of people were very upset about this. They said, why are we helping Ukraine? They're this corrupt country. A lot of lies were made up about this. And people were upset because they felt like we were giving Ukraine some things of value for a war that wasn't our problem, and we weren't getting anything in return. And a lot of people felt like if Ukraine didn't get shipments from us, they would crumble immediately. In reality, what the reality was is that Ukraine only got a tiny fraction of all of the conventional equipment that was promised to them, whether that be tanks, armored vehicles, missiles, etc. They got some stuff, but they only got a tiny fraction of what was promised and not nearly as much as most people actually think. And yet, despite only getting a tiny amount of these conventional munitions, Ukraine was able to successfully hold off Russia for several years, to the point that the war has been ongoing for several years, and we're still talking about this. And Ukraine was able to do that because they kept making advances in drone technology, to the point that now the rhetoric around Ukraine has completely changed. And it has changed most notably, for example, in people like Donald Trump, who has gone from a position of, we don't want to help Ukraine, we're just giving them handouts, we want to maybe sell them weapons and make profit, to a position of where the United States is now actually going to be purchasing some of Ukraine's military technology, because Ukraine actually has a surplus of that, even though they're in a war against Russia. And just think about how significant that is. Ukraine is still at war against Russia. They're a country that most people thought needed handouts, but in reality, the position Ukraine is in today is where they have a surplus of world-class military equipment that nobody else has, that they are now selling to other countries like the United States. And this big shift has caused also the United States to begin talking about providing Ukraine with different kinds of weapon systems. And I know there's a lot of political bluff and bluster and all of this, but it is undeniable that there has been a change in rhetoric, especially among Donald Trump and his like, since Donald Trump took office. And that change in rhetoric can largely be tracked back to a decision that Ukraine made in some headlines that not a lot of people noticed. And perhaps this could be a coincidence, but I really don't think it is. And the shift started to happen around the time where articles started to coming out saying that Ukraine was going to use its data from its drones and its AI algorithms as leverage over the United States, basically saying to the United States, we are not going to give you our data unless you give us the weapons that we need today in return. So in case you missed what I just said, if you remember back to Donald Trump's famous meeting with Zelensky in the White House, the one that just blew up and went terribly, what I just said is that even though people said Ukraine didn't have the cards, it turns out that Ukraine indeed does have the cards, and they're not just using those cards against Russia, but the cards they have are actually so significant that they are actually using them over the United States as leverage to get things they want from the United States. And they're doing that in a friendly way, but it is still leverage where Ukraine is proving that they have something of value that other people want. Now, one thing that I'm constantly told on this channel is that I share information that's hard to find in mainstream media. And that's a shame, because nothing that I share is a secret. It's often just buried beneath media bias. In 2025, most media outlets are more focused on defending a narrative than they are on actually uncovering objective facts. And that can be hard to navigate and see through, but I do have a tool that I use to help, which is Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Ground News makes it easy to spot and avoid media bias by showing every side of a story. Take the recent example of Trump and Putin's meeting being cancelled. Ground News quickly summarizes potential bias, showing where the lines divide. Left-leaning outlets are focused on implying the whole thing was a waste of time, putting the blame on Trump, while right-leaning outlets put the blame on Putin and Russia's continued insistence on conquering Ukraine. What's interesting here is that the political right is now voicing opinions that agree with what the political left has been saying for a long time. And there's a lot of potential common ground here, but both sides seem blind to that. Ground news helps us to see what we otherwise wouldn't and uncover blind spots. There's a lot more to ground news, which is best seen if you head over to their website and explore it for yourself. It's a great tool that I like to use, and you can use it too. In fact, if you use the link in the description of this video or scan the QR code on screen, you can actually get 40% off a Vantage plan, which is the plan that I use to get access to all of their features. Click or scan now and try it out for yourself. And thanks to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. So to explain why this is so significant and why the United States is having to turn to Ukraine to buy these drones instead of just developing them themselves, I want to use another example of technological innovation and how that completely changed the world. Again, not just for the people using the technology, but everybody else. And for that, I want to go back to World War I. A lot of people know that World War I started kind of as a traditional Napoleonic type war. It was not exactly a Napoleonic war, but there were still people at the beginning of World War I using horses and cavalry, charging at people with swords. And there were also these large field type tactics where people thought, we're just going to go stand up our armies on the field. We're going to sort of navigate them around each other. And we're going to fight this war the way we've always fought it. And that ended up being terrible because World War I saw the introduction of so many mass casualty weapons, whether that be gas, like mustard gas, whether that be machine guns. And it came to the point where, cavalry used to be the most effective weapon on the battlefield, but now a guy with a machine gun could take out a huge portion of your cavalry, and the cavalry very quickly became quite obsolete. And that's part of the reason World War I descended into trench warfare. People couldn't fight in the way they were used to fighting. Casualties were super high, so they just dug in and kind of just sat there and tried to figure out what was going on. And as part of figuring out what was going on, they had to develop new technology to get them out of the trenches, sort of exactly like what we see in Ukraine today, in a parallel example where the war started with World War II type tactics and descended into trench warfare and drone warfare as each country is trying to out-innovate the others. When you look at this change from cavalry being the effective weapon to vehicles, tanks being the effective weapon, you can see how this can change not just the battlefield, but the things that go on behind the battlefield. Because leading up to World War I, and I've said this before, to support a large army of cavalry, you had to have good pasturage, to have, a lot of horses and the strongest horses, etc. And so for a time, you would see pasturage as actually being a strategic resource. And actually, if you're familiar with the game Civilization 6, this is actually reflected in that game. And a lot of the countries that were powerful in Europe, in medieval Europe, were the countries that had the best pasturage land, the best control of the strategic resource. As World War I happened, the strategic resources completely changed. It was no longer pasturing land, it was now iron, it was now oil, etc. And that not only changed how war was fought, it also changed the boundaries of countries as they sought to get control of these new strategic resources so that they could have more control, more power in the future. We are seeing something like that happen now with the new types of weapons, which are now AI weapons. Again, drones, where the biggest piece of this is not the drone itself, but it's actually the data that feeds the AI algorithm. And in fact, if AI drones or AI weapons in general are the weapons of the future, the country that is the most powerful is no longer the country like the United States with the biggest stockpiles of tanks. It's no longer a country like the United States with free access to energy or free access to raw materials. All those things matter to a degree, but they only matter if you also have access to the new strategic resource, which when it comes to AI is data, which Ukraine controls. And it seems very clear to me that Ukraine is now using this data as strategic leverage to get what they want from the United States. And it is now that Ukraine is using this data as part of their position of strength that people are finally treating them the way they deserve to be treated. Now, for those who have been watching this channel for a long time, you'll probably be familiar with this because this is something I said a long time ago. And if we can sort of pat ourselves on the back again, I just want to say that, a couple months back, I was saying these types of things and people said that I was like the dumbest person ever for saying that Ukraine could ever have leverage over the United States just from data sharing. I was treated like it was the most ridiculous idea ever. But now indeed it has actually happened. Again, another example of what I said at the beginning of this video. The evolutions in technology, the evolutions in warfare, they are always treated as ridiculous until they happen, even while they are happening. So with that in mind, what are some of the implications of this? Well, as I said, it doesn't just affect, the countries that are producing and using weapons. It also affects every country that controls strategic resources, and it affects, who are going to be the power players in the future. And so when we look at Ukraine in particular, it's hard for me to make predictions, but maybe you can have some critical thinking on other countries, on how this new change in warfare might affect other countries, including your own. But when it comes to Ukraine in particular, what we can very clearly see is that Ukraine is going to come out of their war against Russia as far more powerful than they were before the war. And that is true even if they reach a peace deal with Russia that allows Russia to keep their territory. Because Ukraine now controls something that is far more important than land in the future of warfare and in the future of geopolitics. They control the weapons, the state-of-the-art weapons that every other major country is going to want in order to be prepared for the warfare of the future. Even if they don't want to fight the warfare, they're going to need Ukraine's weapons to be prepared to defend themselves. And so Ukraine is gaining a lot of soft power. And you could say they're even gaining a lot of hard power. And that is a very significant development of this war that I don't see a lot of people talking about, but you see very clear evidence of it in the fact that now more than Ukraine going to other countries for stuff, we are seeing a flip of other countries going to Ukraine for stuff. Now, as I said, we are still in the very early stages of a lot of these things. A lot of these weapons are being produced, but they're not actively fulfilling roles on the battlefield other than prototypes and concept proving. And so that means right now there is a major area of opportunity that people are not realizing, and I wish they would have realized it like 3 years ago, but they didn't, so I hope people will realize it now. Where countries like the United States and a lot of European countries that have large stockpiles of conventional weapons, tanks, armored vehicles, etc., that are largely going to become obsolete in the future, they have an opportunity to get value out of those weapons now and to save lives now instead of just letting it not only rust away, but also become a lot more irrelevant in the warfare of the future, where they can actually give those weapons to Ukraine or even sell them to Ukraine at a good cost in exchange for what true allies do. We give you and we get in return. Ukraine can start sharing more of their data. Ukraine can start selling more of their drones. And this is really a win-win situation that European countries and the United States really needs to take advantage of. Right now, if we give Ukraine Abrams or Bradleys that are going to go out of commission, those can get some use on the battlefield today. They're still not completely obsolete, and they can help save people's lives, and they can help in this war faster. And they can also help us get goodwill with a country that is going to be one of the biggest geopolitical players in our generation. And so if I am a political leader in the United States, that is exactly what I am pushing my country to do right now. Who cares if we have thousands of tanks or thousands of armored vehicles? I'm not saying those are the numbers we have, but who cares if we have all this equipment in warehouses somewhere in Nevada that then rusts and goes out of business and goes obsolete when we can actually put that to effect today? People often focus on this as if it's a cost or we're giving things away for free. But the reality is that we already built these things. And if they become obsolete, that's a cost too. And so the biggest cost to us would be these things not being used in any way that benefits us at all and just rusting away. We have a chance to use them to our benefit. We really should put a lot more behind Ukraine and support them as much as we possibly can right now. Not just because it's the right thing to do. I do think it's the right thing to do, and that's the primary reason to do it. But also because at this point, it is in our best interests. Right now, a lot of the world looks foolish because they are hoarding horses, pasture land, and cavalry to prepare themselves for the war of tomorrow, not realizing that what they should be trying to do is get their hands on as much iron ore and as much oil as possible. But hey, you know what? The world has been through many iterations of this. People have always made the same mistakes. I guess we have to expect that we're going to make the same mistakes too, because unfortunately, nobody ever listens, nobody ever learns from history. However, if you're watching this video, I know you like to learn from history, and so if you appreciate videos like this, please do like this video and subscribe to the channel. Those things are both completely free. They help me out a lot though. And if you really enjoy this channel, if you've been watching for a while and you get a lot of value at it, I would just ask you to consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member to help support this channel. Those things are completely voluntary. I don't put a whole lot of stuff behind paywalls, but it's just a way to support this work and support this community as a whole. I really appreciate all of the support. You guys really do make these videos possible. So with that in mind, I will see you on the next one.